So for those of you who don't know me, and I think I pretty much know everyone at this point, but I'll just reintroduce myself. I'm Professor Art Arbach, and I'm the professor for our research internship, our California Policy Research Internship, Policy 395. We thank, obviously, the students for being here, but more importantly, the partners. Just to give you, and I know Steve's heard this little spiel, but to give you a little backstory on our program, it began about 4 years ago. Kirsten and I were sort of going back and forth trying to figure out how many years we've done this. But we'd actually brought on an outside provider, Project Vote Smart, some of you may have heard. They came on campus, we provided them interns to do research for us, and that contract ended and they left. We really felt that there was a void, there was a real interest for students to do research different than what they might experience in a traditional internship program. And so myself and Dan and Kirsten and several others got together and we sort of cobbled together and sort of guessed at how this might work to bring in outside providers who could use original research in their lines of work. And I always like to start off by saying this program would not work without the time and efforts of our providers. So thank you, and can I please have the students give a little hand right there for our providers. You are the core of this program, and without you all, we wouldn't get very far. So beyond our fabulous providers, there are a lot of logistics that go into Policy 395, and I'm sure at least the students are aware of that. Although I tend to get a lot of face time with the students, this program also couldn't operate without Jody Epstein. She is my right arm, my left arm, and my left and right feet. Pretty much everything. Jody helps coordinate all of the student gatherings, the bi-monthly meetings, coordinating with the partners. Jody does a fabulous job, but as you can see, the entirety of our back row, starting with Laura Hill, Tanya Mercado, Alyssa Rangel, and Kirsten Olson, and Jody, of course. It takes a true village to make this program operate, and they do just a wonderful job, so could we please thank them as well. As we, before we begin here, we're starting with Team NALEO today. Let me give you the program. Presentations are roughly 30 minutes in length. The students will come up here and offer up their presentations with sort of a culmination of all their research. At that point, then, I'll go ahead and moderate the question and answer period, which is another 30 minutes. We always like to defer to the partners to start with, but we do encourage other students in the room to also participate in the Q&A. And you know, it's really about sort of hashing out the work that they've done over the last 15 weeks. And hopefully you'll find it useful and helpful. Now, we have a invisible person up here today, right? We have Doris Parfait-Claude. I'm sure I'm screwing up her name, and she's not here to hear that. But she will be online with us in just a few minutes. She is in Washington, D.C., and works on the policy arm of NALEO, and so she'll be calling in. She has been working with us all semester as well. So we'll be getting questions, I'm sure, from Doris, as well as the other representatives from NALEO. So with no further ado, this is where the hearts start to beat a little bit more from Team NALEO. Can I have the members of Team NALEO come up? They'll be introducing themselves as well as their research question, and then we will go from there.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is John Donnelly, and with me are my fellow research interns, Raimerz-Jimenez, Lida Dianti, Samantha Levra, and Kara Pryor. This semester, we have been working with the NALEO Educational Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that works for the inclusion of Latinos into the American political process. NALEO's programs address a large number of factors involved in the immigration integration process, including citizenship, public service, professional development opportunities, civic engagement, and advocacy work within local communities. Currently, the Migration Policy Institute estimates that immigrants and their U.S.-born children represent about 1/4 of the nation's population. And although there are federal agencies and programs designed to aid this great number of people in the integration process, their efforts are often not sufficient and disjointed, which is why our task this semester was to provide an ideal structure for a federal office which would coordinate efforts around the country to facilitate the process of immigrant integration. And this prospective office would be called the Office of New Americans. It would be based in Washington, D.C., manage 2 federal grant programs, and provide policy recommendations regarding immigration at the federal level. In terms of our strategy, over the past few months we have conducted interviews and detailed research into 5 different coordinating offices at the federal level listed on this slide. By examining each office carefully, we have deduced what works and what doesn't work in terms of cross-agency collaboration. And with this knowledge, have put together a list of structural and policy-oriented recommendations for the Office of New Americans. So throughout the next few minutes of your time, we will each provide an overview of our research on a specific coordinating office, being sure to highlight its good practices and its not so good practices. And at the end, we're going to tie this all together by presenting a snapshot of what the Office of New Americans will look like. And to start us off, Luis is going to talk about the Office of Science and Technology Policy.
Thank you. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy is an office within the Executive Office of the President. It was established by Public Law 94-282 by the 94th Congress in May 11, 1976, when it was signed into law by President Gerald Ford. Its purpose is to advise on scientific, engineering, and technological aspects of issues that span across various agencies and policy dimensions. It centers around specifically the director of the OSTP, who is then empowered to go ahead and build this organization into a larger one depending on the policy of the president or the administration. It's most relevant when its science and technology issues transcend various policy dimensions, so for instance budgetary, economic, international security, things of that nature, or they're highly controversial, such as global warming, or they're highly visible to the public, such as the Apollo moon landings and space exploration. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about just provide a brief overview of the OSTP, and I'm going to start by speaking about its coordination efforts. So you have the National Science and Technology Council. It's served as an internal science and technology advisory board for the president, and it's composed of all these federal agencies that together go ahead and devise the best policies with regards to science and technology to be implemented at the federal level. Next, you have the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, also known as PCAST, and it's composed of, it's the same thing as the NSTC, except it's an external board. So it's composed primarily of high-level executives, leaders in academia, and people who run NGOs that relate to science and technology. Lastly, you have the Office of Management and Budget, and between the two, they set priorities for research and development for the upcoming fiscal year between all the federal agencies. So this kind of collaboration between the agencies allows them to mitigate the duplication of efforts, so you don't have two agencies working on research and developing the same type of products for the same purpose. As far as successes, I can point to the legislation. Title 3, Article 2 of the United States Code 112 allows the OSTP to go ahead and pull manning and personnel from other federal agencies that aren't associated with the Executive Office of the President, but have overlapping fields and detail them onto their agency. Now the cool thing and the most relevant thing about this is that they don't have to go ahead and repay the detailing agency back. So for instance, the 2013 fiscal year had a budget of $5.7 million, and that was enough to fund about 31 personnel. However, the OSTP required 93 personnel, so the way that they pulled these additional people, or about 43 other people for the OSTP, was basically from other federal agencies. Legislation also has strengths in that it provides permanence to the office, so it can't just be simply wiped out from one administration to the next. And lastly, the legislation established the director's responsibility along with the OSTP, which gives it that kind of flexibility. It defines the director's responsibilities, and based on the administration that's coming in and going out, he can go ahead and tailor the organization to meet their policy needs. As far as successes, the OSTP is highly transparent. It's visible on social networks like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, so it reaches out to the younger generations, younger Americans who might otherwise just not necessarily notice what the OSTP is up to in their efforts. It also has a very detailed and excellent website, so anything you need to know about the OSTP, from the founding legislation to its organizational structure to who works in what office, can be found on there. It also does coordination and collaboration efforts pretty well. So one of the things that it does, as I was talking about earlier, is it divides up the responsibilities based on the incoming president's policies. So it varies from one administration to the next, but basically, for example, you have the environmental and energy director who's in charge of that specific department. And what they do is they develop things, like clean energy, things of that nature. It's pretty good for also deconflicting, like I was mentioning earlier, deconflicting efforts, so that one agency takes lead on a particular issue rather than having 2 or 3 agencies go ahead and overlap the responsibilities. As far as shortcomings, there is uneven funding and staffing from one year to the next, so I have this graph over here that kind of shows basically how each one of these administrations utilize their OSTP personnel. We also have policy tensions and power struggles, because every time you make a new office within the White House, there's going to be more people vying for influence amongst the offices themselves, and particularly between the science and technology community and the office of the president. And the last part is a lack of support for the president's policies. So I mentioned the policy tensions and power struggles beforehand, because in the past what happened was that the OSTP represented the interest of the science and technology community, and President Nixon basically just dismantled it. I'll be followed by Lida and the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
Thank you, Luis. I spent this semester researching the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This office works to assist refugees with accessing mainstream opportunities and resources. Actually, a great example of this was in the past year, the fiscal year of 2014, where the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, welcomed refugees from 67 countries. The highest admissions were from Iraq and Burma. And they're able to do so through there's 7 departmental divisions. So first, they have a division dedicated to anti-trafficking in persons. Next, we have refugee assistance. Third is refugee help. Fourth, resettlement services. Fifth, children's services. Sixth, a division devoted to policy, and the last one, the 7th one, would be budget and data analysis. And each division is actually correlated to the office's 6 guiding principles. Okay, so how does the organizational structure affect how this office works? The successes of the organization are related to the effective and logical distribution of tasks with respect to office divisions. So like I was referring to with the 6 guiding principles. Each division is specialized to provide social services so refugees are able to become self-sufficient. Another thing that this office does particularly well is outreach and strategic partnerships. So I know NALEO has a huge focus on cross-agency collaboration. And they collaborate at the state, federal, and local levels. They use federal agencies, such as the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. They also use mutual assistance associations, which are ethnic and community-based organizations. Specifically, the Division of Resettlement Services and Refugee Assistance, they work to make citizenship more accessible, and I know NALEO focuses on that a lot as well. I was actually fortunate enough to speak to Maria Stella Fisher, who works at the office of the director. And some of the things she talked about was the first thing that she focused on was the importance of the community service block. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has expanded its local and regional presence through the use of regional representatives, and she's focused a lot on including communities so that there is a direct linkage between the office and the actual immigrants. Another thing she talked about was the importance of keeping mainstream and non-federal actors accountable. They need to know that immigration needs are not being met. Okay, shortcomings. So what this office can improve on relates to finding by the American Civil Liberty Union. They've actually complained about the Office of Refugee Resettlement, claiming that the office has not been consistent in reporting allegations involving Border Patrol as required by federal child abuse reporting laws. This is just simply, this can be improved simply just by increasing accountability and maybe implementing a better system for checks and balances within the divisions themselves. And now Samantha will talk about the Office of National AIDS Policy.
Thank you. So over the course of the past semester, I led the Office of National AIDS Policy. It was created in 1993 by executive order under President Clinton. And it's tasked with coordinating the continuing efforts to reduce the number of HIV infections through education and coordinate care and treatment as well. And so in its more contemporary role, the main focus has been on the development of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy. This really goes over these three goals in a more comprehensive way, and there was also the development of the Federal Implementation Program. So that was just completed in 2014, and there has been a policy report update on that as well. A little bit more about ONAP. It is currently staffed by 6 people. There's the director, and then a core policy team made up of the senior policy advisor, the assistant policy advisor, and the senior program manager. In addition, there's also an executive assistant to the director and a communications director who also works with the Domestic Policy Council. So a little bit more about some of the successes of this office. There's a lot of perks to being a White House agency and being an executive office. You're more able to make connections with other top policy officials, and that really gives ONAP access to policy reports, to different research done by top officials in the HIV/AIDS community. You're also more able to work with a smaller staff since you are at the top of the executive branch. In addition, ONAP did a really good job at cross-agency collaboration. So during the development and the implementation of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, there was cooperation from agencies at the federal, state, and local level. So this included federal agencies such as the CDC, the FDA, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Labor. And so I actually was fortunate enough to be able to interview the former director, Jeffrey Crawley, who served from 2009 to 2011. And he really stressed the importance of setting a limited engagement on the agenda. You want to have a set engagement versus an ongoing series of meetings. If you have this limited engagement, you're more likely to get top policy officials and top program managers from different agencies versus getting junior staff if you have an unlimited series of engagements. And this is really important to keep in mind since the Office of New Americans will be orchestrating cross-agency collaboration. Something else that the Office of National AIDS Policy did really well was community outreach. So there's 14 different community discussions all across the country where ONAP was able to get input from thousands of different citizens on policy recommendations. And so in dealing with all these different community discussions, the policy officials from ONAP were able to meet with diverse policy officials all across the country. So this included state AIDS directors, elected officials, as well as state and local officials that deal with AIDS policy. A couple of shortcomings. Since it is a White House office, it is very much up to the commitment of the president. The president has the ability to dictate resources and dictate funding. So ONAP was actually pretty dormant during the latter Bush years. However, President Obama has been very committed to this issue. He actually gave ONAP a budget of $1.4 million per year when coming up with the National HIV/AIDS Strategy. There's also a limited amount of staff and little opportunity for office expansion. The structure is very set as an executive office. There's a set number of interns, a set number of detailees. However, when you are an executive office, you are able to work with a smaller staff. And then one comment that Jeffrey Cawley had was the feasibility of getting the Office of New Americans in the White House itself, simply because his fear is that if the White House opens its door to the Office of New Americans, that opens, it means it must open its doors to several other causes that are also advocating for a White House office. Now Kara is going to talk a little bit more about the Hispanic Task Force on Federal Employment.
Thank you. So this semester, I was tasked with researching the Hispanic Task Force on Federal Employment. This task force was created in 2011 by executive order, spearheaded under the Clinton administration, but came to fruition under Bush. The task force was created specifically to tackle the issue of underrepresentation of Hispanics in the workplace. This office was designed to provide employment opportunities and discuss progress for representing Hispanics in the workforce. The structure of this office includes representatives from 40 different agencies, along with several Hispanic organizations. This allows for a range of diverse representatives to offer their own unique perspectives in assessing employment opportunities for Latinos. This organization is guided under the Director of the United States Office of Personnel Management, Catherine Arculeta, on providing special hiring programs intended to recruit and meet the needs of all Latino immigrants. And now I will talk about the successes of this office. The Federal Task Force is involved in California policy as it has utilized college campuses in the state. In 2012, the office entered into collaboration with Cal State Fullerton and Cal State Dominguez Hills. The purpose of this was to facilitate lasting relationships within the universities by allowing Hispanics to serve as adjunct professors and create internship opportunities for the student body. This localization in California is highly relevant because this program can be utilized by NALEO and the Office of New Americans to give Latinos education opportunities in this region, as it is home to the third largest population of Hispanics in the United States. This office has an organized set of goals, which include accountability, student employment, and strategic communications. A clear mission statement such as this gives rise to productivity, as evidenced by recent successes in this office. For example, among the 25 large federal agency and department workforces, 20 increased their percentage of employed Hispanics from 2011 to 2012. Because this office was enacted by Executive Order 13171, this creates a system of checks and balances within the office because they are held accountable for gathering information and submitting annual progress to the President. And now I will transition to some of the shortcomings of this office. Sometimes within federal agencies, splintering of an office can occur, creating duplication of other offices. This is problematic because essentially you have multiple offices doing the exact same thing when there could be one office centrally focused on an issue. Instead, the duplications led to the dispersive resources, focus, and funding. What I'm talking about is that in 2011, another office named the Federal Council on Hispanic Employment was created. 8 months later, it was terminated. However, this posed significant challenges to the Hispanic Task Force on Federal Employment because their progress could have been stronger with joint efforts. In addition, because there is no devoted staff and the office is only required to meet semi-annually, it would seem as if they only submit annual reports to the President instead of truly enacting any substantial policy change within their alleged $11 million budget. Now, I will hand the presentation to John, who will speak about the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy.
Thank you, Kara. My own semester's worth of research was spent examining the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy. And for the most part, this office can be considered a failed coordinating agency at the federal level because it only existed for 2 years. The office was a non-cabinet level executive office, which was created by President Obama through executive order as a part of his administration's goal to send a strong message about energy policy reform. In terms of its structure, the office was very small, consisting only of a czar-style director, Carol Browner, and her deputy assistant, Heather Zeichel. And their goal was to work amongst various government agencies and departments to promote a single and coherent message about energy and climate policy. In doing this, the office worked with departments such as the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Interior, etc. So as you can see, it took on a very large coordinating role at the federal level, especially considering its size. And additionally, Carol Browner worked amongst the private sector to ensure cogency and consistency of the White House's policy message around the country. Now, although this office was moderately successful in the sense that it did achieve some new emissions regulations and funding for clean energy businesses through the American Recovery Act of 2009, it ultimately failed in pushing progressive cap and trade legislation through Congress. In 2011, this office was eliminated by Congress after only 2 years of operation, and it's no secret that its elimination was spurred by the politics of the 2010 midterm elections in which the Republicans took over the House of Representatives. So what we really saw with this situation was a very energetic and ambitious office that ultimately lacked the structure, manpower, and congressional influence to create substantial change. So considering that the Office of New Americans will have a similar coordinating role at the federal level, what can we learn from the failures of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Policy? In terms of cross-agency collaborations, Carol Browner was actually fairly effective due to her heightened status as the former director of the EPA. However, this success is definitely overshadowed by the office's shortcomings. The first being that a czar-style office often creates skepticism and mistrust amongst the public and especially amongst members of Congress. Criticism of the office and Ms. Browner included accusations of backdoor policymaking deals with federal officials and agencies, and comments about her ability to wield unchecked power. Now, although some of that is overinflated, we do agree that a czar-style office runs the risk of being unchecked in its actions, which is definitely unfavorable in our system of government. Secondly, the office and Carol Browner experienced strained relationships with members of Congress, both on a personal and political level. And as we see, this office was eliminated because of this, because it was eliminated by a bill that came out of the House of Representatives. And third, building off of that point, the office's sole reliance on congressional funding definitely proved to be unfavorable, as Congress can cut funding with just a few votes and the swipe of a pen. So, in reviewing the 5 offices altogether, we have seen both shortcomings and successes. Shortcomings in terms of efficiency, conflict resolution with political enemies, and even publicity, as was seen by Kara with the Hispanic Task Force on Federal Employment. And successes in coordination, community outreach, and even budgeting, as was seen by Luis with the OSTP. So, based on these observations, we now have a list of recommendations for the Office of New Americans. Number 1, we believe that the office will have to be created by an executive order given the current political climate. However, this means that the office must have a workable relationship with Congress if it plans to influence immigration policy and push for progressive legislation. And number 2, we favor a structure that includes a separation of powers, meaning that it will have lower-level assistant directors and regional representatives who work on specific aspects of immigrant integration. In this way, the office will collaborate with other agencies more effectively and reach more people in need of aid. And now Lida is going to talk about this structure further.
Thank you. Okay, so as you can see, we tried to make the structure of this office pretty straightforward. So the proposed office structure is led by the Office of the Director, and within this head office, there are 5 key divisions managed by assistant directors. First, we have the Assistant Director of Naturalization, and then we have the Assistant Director of Education, and third, we have the Assistant Director of Employment. And so these three make citizenship, education, and highly skilled jobs accessible to immigrants. Fourth, we also have the Assistant Director of Outreach. And lastly, we have the Assistant Director of Financial Affairs. And now Luis will discuss what the proposed office budget will look like.
So one of the big things that we noticed in our research was that by far the largest consumer of the allocations provided by the fiscal year budget was manpower, basically. The OSCP is a perfect example of that. You have $5.7 million and it only paid for 31 people. So one of the things that really stuck out to us was acquiring additional staff that was enabled through legislation. So you can go ahead and pull people from other organizations who might have splintered off, like the organization that Carol was studying, and just pull them into your own organization so that you don't have basically, I hate to say it again, but a duplication of efforts. You don't have two people reinventing the wheel. Another thing is using outreach and fellowship programs to go ahead and grab civil service professionals. So for instance, people in graduate school, going ahead and engaging them and providing a fellowship and possibly, experience in a policy field so that that counts for academic credit. So through this outreach means we can go ahead and get people who would otherwise cost a lot of money to the government and not necessarily extort them because they're getting something in return, but definitely cut the cost on how this is going to work. Another thing is a limited number of non-essential permanent employees. So you have your full-time employees that run kind of like a skeleton crew, and basically you go ahead and you plug and play detainees, contractors, and fellows like I mentioned earlier, and in some cases volunteers to suit the needs of this office. Lastly, by having this permanent number of full-time or this permanent cadre of full-time employees, what you do is you mitigate a loss of organizational knowledge from one administration to the next. The second big thing I wanted to hit on was the budget formulation process. One of the things that I noticed was that the Office of Science and Technology Policy is pretty good at reaching out, or it basically has to collaborate with the Office of Management and Budget and figure out which federal agency is going to take point on a particular issue area that spans across multiple agencies. So if you have 4 or 5 different agencies with the same basic responsibility, basically setting the priority for which agency is responsible for what task. And that way you go ahead and you deconflict efforts and you basically have an overall more efficient office. Next slide. Now we follow by Samantha.
So a little bit more on the work that the Office of New Americans will be doing in coordinating cross-agency collaboration. There needs to be an emphasis on increased coordination, cooperation, and collaboration with other federal agencies. This can be accomplished by the importance of keeping momentum for set projects. So if the Office of New Americans is to make the work it does sustainable, it needs to really focus on different set projects. So whether this is teaching English and civics, promoting citizenship and naturalization, or working with receiving communities to better support their efforts to accept immigrants. There's also the importance of setting a limited engagement agenda. This makes it more likely that the Office of New Americans will be able to meet with top policy officials from a variety of federal agencies in order to collaborate. Agenda setting is a key component of keeping things sustainable. It's also really important to appoint an expert in the field as the director of the Office of New Americans. The Office of New Americans really needs someone well-respected, someone who's good with public relations. John discussed this with Carol Browner as the former director of the EPA, and then having a lot of authority as the director of White House Office of Energy and Climate Policy. It also would be really beneficial for the Office of New Americans to do community outreach, much like the Office of National AIDS Policy did. They could get input from a variety of different sources, whether this is immigrant communities on their experiences with local and state agencies, what worked, what didn't work, and policy recommendations for a federal agency. There also could be input from receiving communities about what they need to better support immigrant integration, as well as meeting with other officials to compile best practices. Now Kara's going to talk a little bit more about what publicizing the Office of New Americans is going to look like.
Thank you. Okay, because this office did not have a central devoted staff, it's difficult to find information about this office other than annual reports made public. This kind of transparency is a very positive thing in a federal office, as was seen in Luis's Office of Science and Technology. Therefore, it is detrimental to the success of an office because those who wish to become involved in facilitating representation of Hispanics in the workforce do not know how. This is why I recommend the Office of New Americans ensures it has its own website with a staff directory to make information readily accessible. The Office of New Americans news, programs, and progress should be well known to the general public in order to generate substantial support. For instance, the Office of Personnel Management has over 31,000 followers on Twitter and consistently educates and updates the public about important knowledge and news. The Office of New Americans should utilize social media to take advantage of any support it can receive, especially among the millennial generation. In addition, the Office of New Americans should try its best to prevent any splintering off of its office, much like what occurred with the Federal Task Force on Hispanic Employment. They can prevent this by cross-agency collaboration efforts, as Sam previously discussed, to ensure no one becomes dissatisfied in attempts to create their own office with their own agenda. This will ensure primary focus and funding will remain with the Office of New Americans, therefore allowing more progress to occur in the pathway to citizenship. Now, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending our presentation. We will now conclude to our question segment.
All right, so we now have time for question and answer, and I know we need to bring Doris online, so I'm going to defer to the technology people because that is definitely not my thing.
Grab some water in the meantime. I'm going to give her a call.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start.
I'll let her know that she knows to call in.
Okay.
So I'm going to give her a call, tell her to call in, and then she should pop up.
Okay.
You should hear a ding ding.
Perfect.
Hologram of Doris.
That's right. Maybe we'll start with you all, and just in terms of any questions you might have for our panelists, and then Doris sort of plugs in, we'll plug in. Oh.
Sure.
Hello?
Oh, hi Doris, this is Art Auerbach. How are you?
I'm quite well. Do I still need to answer Jody on the phone, or are we good?
No, I think we're good. I'm going to turn the volume up here. I'll try not to scream. It seems like every time I talk to this thing, I'm screaming. So, were you able to listen in on the presentation?
Absolutely, and I'm very impressed by the work, so congratulations, team.
Great, thank you. Perhaps we'll have you start off with some questioning. We've got other members from NALEO here who are also going to participate. So I'll turn it over to you for any questions you might have.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with some of the bigger picture questions. So, this year I've outlined an ideal office, and I was wondering what do you think would be the biggest challenges in implementing it? So if this were to actually be a proposal to the White House, what do they think would be the biggest objections? What do they think would be the biggest sources of resistance?
Who would like to start off with maybe some of the biggest objections you would see in the current administration? Any thoughts?
In my research, I found...
Maybe identify who you are so Doris can...
Hi, Doris, I'm Kara. In my research, I found that there was just a substantial amount of academia and literature writing on discrimination towards immigrants and towards people who wish to become citizens of the United States. And I feel like there needs to be significant knowledge on immigration integration should not be limited to just immigrants. I feel like the Office of New Americans would do well to try to have initiatives to educate everyone about tolerance and acceptance of new immigrants.
in the United States.
So I couldn't agree more. From what I heard from Doris, and I don't want to speak for you, Doris, it sounded more like what would some of the administration's obstacles be to creating this in terms of sort of logistics? Is that what you were sort of thinking of?
That's what I was going for, yeah.
Yeah, what about logistics? I mean, we have a Democratic president, obviously, Republican Congress. The president can do this through executive order, but there are a lot of internal obstacles, I would think, that might get in the way.
Yeah, hi Doris, this is John. I think that it's definitely, the biggest obstacle would be the Republican Congress right now. I know that Sam mentioned in her presentation that in terms of getting this office into the White House, it might be a little bit difficult considering that there's a ton of other issues where advocacy groups are trying to get new White House offices also. So if an Office of New Americans is created, it's almost like these other issues, they're going to want their office to be created. But I definitely think it's the Congress. I know I saw with my office that they just simply cut the funding after 2 years of its existence, which is definitely, we don't want that, of course, with the Office of New Americans. So I think that's definitely the biggest obstacle right now.
Okay. And so have you guys considered how public-private partnerships would be able to at least give it some financial independence?
Good question. Public-private partnership. Are you able to explore that at all?
Hi Doris, it's Louis. As far as public-private partnerships, I think that the best answer I could give you is it depends on who the ONA is able, or the Office of New Americans is able to network with, and who's actually willing to provide the funds itself. I think the way that we went and we figured this office would be with the skeleton crew of full-time employees was that basically the only limitation is the funding provided by Congress on a yearly basis, but I think that some kind of funding from NGOs or an external source would definitely benefit. However, I don't have any organization off the top of my head who'd be willing to.
Can I ask, did any of you all experience or see any outside funding with any of your specific offices that could sort of be used as a template for this one? I'm getting a lot of head nods, Doris.
I do have something to add though, Doris. I think one of the bigger issues with getting a private-public partnership like that is really publicizing the fact that immigrant integration is a problem in the United States right now, because I know certainly going into this semester, I did not think about immigrant integration. Like that's just something I never thought about. So I think if NALEO is able to really publicize this issue that immigrant integration is a problem and we need policy and we need funding to help these people integrate into the economic and political system in the United States, I think that'll definitely draw more private funding for the office.
Just to give you a little bit of the real world perspective, private sector is actually hugely interested in this issue since it's their client base in the future.
Yeah, so and that's probably very distinct from a lot of these other offices that they even looked at. I don't think.
It's just a fun thing to throw in there.
Yeah, is it pretty common to see outside funding, to fund offices like this?
There's a few offices here and there that do it. If it's like a wildlife board, I don't remember the exact title that's best known for having this model. The bigger issue is just setting it up in such a manner that it's viewed as independent and not being bought over by corporate sources.
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions on your end there, Doris?
I guess my very last one is, I think on the regional offices in your ideal model, and I was wondering how you were picturing any collaboration between those offices, or whether you were doing them as more silos within the region.
Regional offices, anyone want to handle that? How that would operate? So like,
Just talk about the regional representatives if you would operate.
Well, in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I actually was able to speak to regional representatives myself. They just basically are very accessible, and they work with ethnic and community-based organizations, and they kind of work on the ground. I know like California has, I think, anywhere from 3 to 5. So they try to keep the numbers very low, and they try to keep the efforts very localized.
Okay, so would you want to say when you finalize this project, how you would have these representatives interact with you, other representatives of other states?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this is a national problem.
Absolutely, but distinctly affects localities, I think, which is so unique about this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so questions from our other representatives from NALEO? Anything that came to your mind?
Yeah, I had a question. Hi, Doris, this is Ophelia. Ignore my text message. I texted you to make sure that you're on the call. I think one of the questions that I had is coming from NALEO. There's a lot of organizations similar to NALEO that are working on immigration integration, civic participation, everything. So what's the role that you saw an organization like NALEO or any other organization play into the Office of the American? What can we bring to the table?
I think what this is just one of the things that I could see them doing is kind of falling under an umbrella where everybody's coordinated under a central government office, so that you don't, even though you have your regional representatives and things of that nature, you have all these organizations that do things, and I'm not sure how well they collaborate, but if they could collaborate at the national level, or perhaps even mobilize, the Hispanic vote, I think it would be very useful in terms of achieving the desired end state.
I also think NALEO could use its existing resources in terms of community outreach, using the contacts you already have, using the established networks you already have to get input from immigrants themselves, and compiling best practices for the Office of New Americans as well.
Other questions or thoughts?
No, just kind of to speak to what you guys were just talking about, or just to give you an example of how regional offices kind of work with organizations like us. We have relationships with UCIS, which is a federal office, but they do have regional representatives, and they do, just speaking to your point, meet with us often, and we do give them best practices and things like that. So that kind of structure does exist in other agencies as well.
Neat. I have a question for you all, and it's really about something we've already touched on a little bit, about the politics of trying to get an office like this put through. Obviously, we have a Republican Congress going on right now, but one would think that Congress is pragmatic enough to understand that this issue is not going to go away, and it is part of something that's going to have to be resolved. Is there some sort of compromise position between the Obama administration and Congress that might be tapped into or touched on or utilized in order to, help usher in a program that could be useful? In other words, is there any middle ground there other than just, we need this and no, you're never going to get it because we're going to defund it?
I think I have an answer. Hi, Doris, I feel that if you were to go ahead and have like some kind of small scale prototype program almost, and have a few people run through it and integrate successfully, and become contributing members of society who pay taxes, it would show that this template works, and you can begin expanding it and funding.
So what would that look like?
The specifics of it.
Well, I'm just wondering. I mean, you started in a state that maybe the states that are most affected by immigration, whether that's California or Texas or things of that nature. I mean, is that what you're envisioning?
Yeah, something, I don't know, just a small local program. I mean, not even running that many people through it. Maybe 20 to 50 people, giving them education, maybe providing something as simple as daycare while people are in class. Things that kind of slip your mind. But for somebody who's a single parent or somebody who's struggling with just the troubles of immigration or just being an immigrant. Stuff that makes their life easier so that they could actually go ahead and fast track through that. I don't think that anybody's unwilling to learn English or willing to better themselves or try to make a better life for their kids. I mean, for the most part, that's why people immigrate here. So it's just a matter of having that opportunity available. So if you have it on a small scale and you can show that it's successful, I think that would kind of prove hey, look, we're actually contributing back to society. Let's start throwing more people in there.
Also, I feel like the best way to entice a conservative Congress would probably be to like sell them, like just think about electoral calculations. Think about,
Get down to brass tacks,
think
right?
about like the Hispanic vote. Like people, there's a whole population of people who are eligible for citizenship but don't have the resources. Like that's an entire like vote in majority, and that's really important if they want to stay in Congress. So they could definitely access the Hispanic vote.
Art?
Yeah, Dan.
I have a question, Pete. First of all, guys, just terrific presentation, really, really well done. I thought you were in a really good place when we met last week, but I can't tell you how impressive a job it was. Really, really nice. We've been talking, a lot of the questions have focused on external challenges, primarily political challenges. But what I gathered from listening to the case studies that you guys each examined is that the reason you created an office like this is to overcome internal challenges. And I guess I'm wondering if any of you found in your research examples of turf wars. In other words, if an office like this is set up to coordinate different components of the bureaucracy, how do you overcome the natural tendency of somebody who has control over something not to fight to keep control over it? So that the external challenges, Lida, your point about Congress, I think is a great one. But how do you convince people who had authority over something to give some of it up to an office like yours? Is there any example of that kind of resistance or overcoming that you found in your research?
I think part of it is really, and we mentioned this, is appointing directors, a director and assistant directors who are very well respected in the field and have a personality that tends towards negotiation. I know that with Carol Browner, that office was actually successful in terms of coordinating between these agencies and bureaucracies like the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, because of her respected status. And I think that if the Office of New Americans is to exist, it should have a director who's similar and expert in the field, who's well respected and can gain the respect of her peers who she's negotiating with, or he's negotiating.
I think my response to that would be, wasn't that your scenario, and yet they were defunded within 2 years?
Right, but I'm saying the structure of the Office of New Americans is much different than that. I'm saying that the director should be someone who is an expert and can negotiate. That's the only thing.
One of the interesting things I found in my research actually is President Obama issued an executive order in 2013 to kind of further the implementation of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy that created an interagency working group. So it created designated leads from a lot of different federal agencies, Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Department of Housing, Department of Justice, and gave the director of ONAP kind of the authority to convene all these different officials from these different agencies to really support the implementation of the National HIV Strategy. So I thought that was a really interesting example of kind of creating this structure for these agencies.
So what I hear you guys saying is not necessarily taking the authority from the existing entities, making sure that they still have a role in the process.
That we're able to convene them to support immigrant integration.
Thank you.
First, I'm sorry, I had to run out at a client fire that hopefully is now only smoldering. We'll see. And hopefully this hasn't been asked. It's sort of following what Dan said and going a little bit more macro. And yes, as Dan just said, great job. Really clear, I understand, and it's a very needed thing that NALEO is doing, continuing to do such great work. I'm curious if, in looking at these different offices, if you found shortcomings or problems that seemed endemic to all of them, as well as to not just necessarily be negative, but also if you found things that you thought were, worked well across all of them that should be, in anything that got any office that would be created from this point forward that, would be a key attribute to make sure it would be successful.
Why don't we start with attributes? Any key attributes that you saw sort of common themes throughout each of the offices?
I think that the offices were very different in terms of their structure and the way they operated. I think what we saw as the most successful and longest lasting office is the Office of Science and Technology, which Luis presented about. I mean, that's existed since when? How long?
1976.
Yeah, and it's one of the biggest coordinating offices in the White House. So I think, I mean, it's a little too big to model the Office of New Americans off of, but they've been very successful in what they've done over the past 40 years.
Any other commonalities on?
Not necessarily a commonality for all of our offices, but for the Office of Science and Technology Policy and my office on AIDS policy, I think having information that's easily accessible, having a website, having a social media presence is a really important attribute, especially in reaching out to this generation and making sure information is easily accessible to a lot of different people.
How about troubling traits, things that sunk the ship?
I think one thing that's common between the office OSCP that I studied and the office that John studied was not making political enemies, because the OSCP or its predecessor went and tried to bamboozle, President Nixon on basically strategic missiles, and once he caught on to it, he just dismantled it. He was not happy, and then President Ford came by and just had to remake it and make legislation so they didn't have to reinvent the wheel from one administration to the next. However, like his office was a Carol Browner. I mean, you just can't go ahead and piss off the wrong people.
I think it begs the question on whether or not you can actually depoliticize such a political issue. I don't know the answer to that. Any thoughts?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, this isn't answering that question, but a problem with my office was that they just weren't really held to any high standards. I mean, they only meet twice a year, and they only submit one annual report. And I remember looking at this graph that showed that Hispanics in the federal workforce had strongly increased. When you look at it, it looks like an upward slope. And then when I looked at the numbers, it was like the number 6% to 8% were right there. So from essentially from the year 2000 to 2012, Hispanics in the workforce, in the federal workforce, had only increased by 1.7% because of this graph. And I think that was a true example of what everybody dislikes about a bureaucracy.
Great. Wonderful. Well, great questions. Doris, any last questions before we sign you off?
Oh, I'm quite good. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope the weather in DC is okay.
It's actually pretty sunny, but thank you for asking.
Absolutely. All right, have a good day. We'll talk to you soon.
You too.
Okay, bye now. All right, so can we please thank our panelists? Great, well, welcome back for our final presentation of the day. We have Steve Kahn from California Strategies.
We haven't present.
Yes, didn't I tell you?
I'm not nervous, at least.
That's a good thing. And Ken Bedoyle from Ralph's Corporation. We appreciate both of you taking the time out of your busy schedules. We know how hard it is to get away in the middle of the afternoon. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much. So enough about me. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the students, and we'll hear about the plastic bag man.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Word, and I'll be presenting alongside Jennifer Robbins, Darren Poliat, Sarah Donna and Chad David on California's plastic bag dilemma and the political and environmental issues and how to respond. So we've been given a task to conduct research with the guidance of California Strategies and Ralph's that best answer the proposed research question. How can Ralph's grocery chain promote sustainable environmentally conscious practices that will garner statewide and millennial population support of the California Senate Bill 270, better known as the plastic bag ban? But before we get started, I'd like to give you a brief background on SB 270. As some of you may know, SB 270 is a bill that will prohibit stores that have a specific amount of sales in dollars or retail floor space from providing a single-use carry-out bag to customers. The bill would also prohibit stores from selling or distributing recycled paper bag at the point of sales unless the store makes the bag available for purchase for 10 cents. Currently in the state of California, there's 139 counties and or cities that currently adopted these ordinances. So now that we covered a brief description of between 270, I'd like to discuss our macro to micro approach. In the process of conducting the research, we felt it was best to tell the story of the plastic bag ban. And so we have a three-pronged approach. It's broken down into historical data, economics and politics, and environmental implications associated with SB 270. In part two, we go into our county analysis of 5 specific counties that we felt would be the most contested. And in our part three, we have our survey findings of the target group, which is between 18 and 25-year-olds, messaging strategies, and our top 3 recommendations. So for part 1, we're looking at the totality of the historical trends and the general issue for a statewide ban. So historical context. San Francisco was the first American city to regulate their use, starting with a ban on non-combustible plastic bags from large supermarkets and chain pharmacies in 2007. As part of its overall strategy to reach zero waste by 2020, it extended the plastic bag ban to other stores in 2012 and 2013. Following the success of San Francisco ban, Washington, D.C. conducted its own trash study of the Anacostia River and discovered that disposable plastic bags were one of the largest sources of litter. As a way to change consumer behavior, members of the Council of D.C. decided to propose a 5-cent fee on plastic bags rather than banning plastic bags outright. And in 2010, Washington, D.C. became the first city in the United States to impose a 5-cent tax on plastic and paper bags. Roughly a year later, in September 2011, Santa Monica became the first city in the United States to have both a plastic bag ban combined with a tax on paper bags. So now I'd like to direct your attention to the graph to the right. So in light blue is California, and in dark blue is the rest of the United States. As you can see, in 2007 to 2014, there has been a significant increase in ordinances against plastic bags. Currently, 1/3 of California's population is covered in plastic bag bans. And as you can see, from 2010 onward, there has been a slow progression. And according to the Earth Policy Institute, plastic bag purchases by retailers have reportedly fallen from 107 million pounds in 2008 to 62 million pounds in 2012. Because of this significant drop in plastic production, plastic industry like the American Chemistry Council or coalitions like the American Progressive Bag Alliance have taken action. Even though the laws largely held up in court, the threat of legal action deterred additional communities from taking action and delayed the process for others. So where are we now with the current bag ban? So currently, in September 2014, SB 270 would ban single-use plastic bags and mandate a 10-cent tax on paper bags. This was big news for California as it was leading the way to be the first state to have such legislation in place. In December 2014, 3 months later, trade groups got enough support to stop SB 270. The American Progressive Bag Alliance successfully blocked the bill with over 5,000 legitimate signatures. Now that SB 270 qualified for referendum, proponents will no longer be able to withdraw from the referendum, and a statewide vote will decide the statewide vote in 2016 will decide the fate of SB 270. So now at this time, I'd like to transition over to politics and economics, where Jenny Robinson will cover.
Thank you. So as with any bill, there's a lot of proponents and opponents for SB 270. So what you have leading mostly the advocates is environmentalists with a lot of help at the state legislative level, and opponents are obviously coming mostly from consumers. So one of the proponent arguments is that plastic bags are actually less efficient when they're distributed at grocery stores because they're only intended for single use, so they're not as able to be used multiple times. You also have the argument that it's environmentally damaging because they're usually not properly disposed of. Somewhere between 1% and 3% of plastic bags are properly disposed of and recycled in the state of California, and it's also very costly. So opponents argue that it's much more convenient to be able to just put your things into a plastic bag and leave the store at the end, and that it's also their ability to be able to choose where their money goes, and if they want to have a plastic bag for free, then they can just donate the money to environmental action groups. And consumer preference has been found that, of course, people are going to prefer something that's a free option, but when there is a fee on the bags, they're much more inclined to go ahead and pay for a reusable bag or bring their own canvas bags from home. So for statewide politics, as you know, it was passed in the Senate with mostly Democratic support. Of the 15 no's, most of those were Republican. And though it has been more of a divisive issue as far as political party on the state level, it's been much less that way with consumers. So the public is faced with several issues regarding their voting yes or no for a plastic bag ban and referendum. And one of the biggest issues is that the nature of the bill is just largely confusing. The language of a plastic bag ban and a plastic bag ban referendum makes them unclear on what a vote yes in 2016 will mean versus what a yes no or versus what a vote no would mean in 2016. So our solution to that is just to educate them on the legislature. What's going to be put up for our 2016 election is going to be a referendum and not a ban. So if that's made clear, then it'll be much easier for people on a statewide level to figure out what they want to vote for. Also, there's a lot of concern of government overreach, which we've found can be easily remedied by making sure that they know it's not a government imposition, but rather a government response to the amount of litter that's ending up on the beaches and in the streets and that sort of thing. And it shouldn't be that hard to do, since according to 2012 Gallup polls, Californians individually rank environmental issues as one of the 3 most important things to them. And so we're kind of thinking that the best thing to do is to appeal to them as an environmental action suit instead of something that's more politically geared. And so when it gets to the ballot, it'll get more attention since it's going to be in a year with a presidential election, which just naturally brings about more voters. So millennials are also a very large playing factor in this political issue, because they're a very, very large demographic, especially in California, but as you can see in the graph on the left, they have a very low voter turnout. And so though they have broad interests and low political presence, the best thing to do is use messaging to target and educate millennials on how valuable their role in the political arena is. As far as economics go, there is a lot of cost associated, and it's estimated that the cost of conversion from high-density polyethylene, which are currently the bags in use, to the low linear polyethylene bags, will be about $78 million in direct and indirect costs. However, that does average out to only about $12 per household per year, which is fairly small. But it could save a lot. So we're looking at 5 million pounds, according to the National Center for Policy Analysis, that could be prevented as far as trash goes from ending up on the beaches and in the streets and in parks and that sort of thing. And it could also save anywhere from $250,000 to $850,000 in waste disposal costs. As I mentioned, it's very expensive to recycle plastic bags, and most of them aren't disposed of properly, which means that they end up in landfills, which are very costly. And as far as previous bans in other areas go, it can be successful even though there is an initial cost associated. And Brownsville, Texas actually adopted a ban in 2009 that was so successful that it not only exceeded its cost of conversion, but it also garnered an extra $1 million for the city. And with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Darren Pouliot, who's going to be telling you a lot more about the environmental costs associated.
Thank you, Jenny. So one of the questions we thought was really important to address were the environmental implications of a bag ban. And that's important not just for the political proponents of the bill who want to see a bill that benefits the environment, but also for Ralphs in terms of making sure you're doing the most sustainable things possible. So with that, I divided it up into the science of the bag and the effectiveness of local bans to see what their effects are on the environment. So to dive into the science of the plastic bag, I'm pulling primarily from a research study by CSU Chico, which combines the 3 major life cycle assessments of various types of plastic and paper bags and goes even further to compare the entire life cycles of every kind of reusable bag to see really what will be the best for the environment. And that study, conducted by Joseph Green, came up with the conclusion that linear low-density polyethylene bags are the best type of bag for the environment. A bit counterintuitive because they're made of plastic, but the research shows that if there's around 40% post-consumer resin content, it's actually the best option for the environment. The study also claimed that the worst type of bag ended up being the single-use paper bag, which is a frequent refrain from opponents of the ban, and polypropylene bags that only get used once. Polypropylene bags, when reused, can be better, but because there's no recycling infrastructure for polypropylene products in California, they aren't as good of an option as linear low-density polyethylene bags. And this research also covered the health effects of reusable bags, another frequently raised political issue. And it turns out that they're minimal to none for most types of reusable bags, according to this and other studies. And reusable plastic bags, like the best type identified above, actually are the least likely to have any sort of contamination or presence of regulated metals in them. So in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of local bag bans, major cities such as Los Angeles, San Jose, and others have already had bans for multiple years now. So we thought it was important to look at what the results for the environment were from those. And so in looking at environmental impact reports from Los Angeles, Palo Alto, San Diego, San Jose, as well as reports 1 to 2 years out about litter surveys, they all concluded that there were no significant environmental impacts in terms of passing a bag ban on plastic bags. And they also identified widespread positive results for the city in a number of areas. So this is just a sampling of the kinds of positive effects that the bans had. So San Jose saw significantly reduced litter and a large change in consumer behavior. Consumers were very willing to switch to reusable bags and away from paper and plastic. Palo Alto found in their impact report that there weren't any sustained business impacts, whether they be large or small, another big political concern. Los Angeles actually found that paper bag usage was lower after the bag ban had been instituted. So one of the major concerns from a sustainability standpoint was that the increase in paper bags, because they tend to be one-for-one worse for the environment than plastic, would make this actually an environmentally unfriendly bill. But with enough people switching over to reusable bags, especially reusable plastic bags, it more than offsets the cost to the environment. And San Diego also observed that there were no health impacts from having people bring their own reusable bags. So the final thing to look at were alternatives to the ban and the fee structure. So every environmental impact report was required to evaluate what are the other options in terms of legislation and how would those impact the environment. And they concluded, in those same 3 cities' environmental impact reports, they all concluded that if you ban both plastic and paper, it's going to be best for the environment. But the worst possible option for the environment, according to these impact reports, was to not have a bag ban at all. And better alternatives always come from the higher the fee, the more likely people are to use reusable bags. So now that we've covered the broad political issues, I'll hand it back to David, who will take us down into a regional analysis of how these issues are playing out.
Thanks, Darren. So, with the aid of PAL strategies, we decided to look at 5 counties that we figured would be the most contested in California. And that region is the southern coastal California and the Central Valley. Starting with San Diego, the most southern county. It would support a plastic bag ban, however it's opposed of a fee. Millennials between an age range of 18 to 30 will be in favor of a plastic bag ban and a fee. Now, the impact on routes is considered marginal because of being the second largest populated county in California. It only has 22 routes and 11 food for less. So because of that, it's a marginal impact on how effective routes can be in campaigning for a plastic bag ban. And here are some demographics. Currently, there are no ban in San Diego County, and with a population of over 3 million, 70% are registered to vote. Now, what's very interesting is the no party preference, the 27%. Of that 27%, 10% is between the ages of 18 and 25. And voter turnout, this data was derived from the US Census Bureau, and of the 25% registered youth who voted in 2012, less than 10% of 18 to 25 actually voted. And there are 2 cities in San Diego County, Solana Beach and Encinitas, who both have a plastic bag ban. However, out of those 2 cities, only one has a route and 0 food for less. At this time, I'll now drive up the coast and transfer it over to Sarah Donovan, who will be covering Orange County.
Thank you so much, David. So now we're going to be discussing Orange County, and it's a very important region to look at, especially discussing the implications of millennial voter turnout. And Orange County has especially interesting info regarding this region. So analysis of voter demographics for Orange County show that though the youth voters are very interested in helping the environment and helping sustain more environmental practices, they would not be likely to go to the polls and actually vote. So we see now that Orange County does not have a ban set in place, but the coastal cities, including Laguna Beach, San Clemente, and Dana Point, Huntington Beach, have all been exposed to prior legislation regarding the ban. And we see that it is significant for Ralph's to really kind of take a look at the implications regarding the ban for millennials and for the populace in Orange County, because there are over 45 Ralph's in Orange County. So looking at some demographics regarding Orange County, we have about 3.1 million living in residents, and we have about 2.1 that are registered voters. And the average income per household is over $75,000, which is well over the national threshold for household income. And we have 73% of registered voters, and then 32% are registered Democrats and 41% are registered Republicans. So we see from voter turnout data conducted by the U.S. Census report that there, of the 64% who are registered voters for the 3.1 million in residents, there are 49.6 who are youth, millennial populated in Orange County who are voters, and then we have 47% registered Democrats for 2012, and then in 2012, about 53% voted Republican. And then with that, we have some statistics. So in the 2012 election against Emkin and Feinstein, 53% voted in her favor. And then it was more of a Republican voter base in Orange County, so they're more likely to vote Republican in Orange County. So the bag ban status, there's no county level ban as we discussed, and the first ordinance was passed in February 2012, and it was effective for large supermarkets in April 2013. It was also expanded to other applicable stores by January 2012. So now I'm going to be turning it over to Chad David, who's going to be discussing Los Angeles County, which is a primarily Democratic region. And what's different about Orange County in relation to Los Angeles County is the fact that in Orange County, they've had more of a legislative precedent, and they're more likely to vote Republican on the issues. And then in Los Angeles County, they have more of a Democratic voter base, so they're more likely to vote in favor of the plastic bag ban.
Thank you, Sarah. After research of Los Angeles County, we can predict that they will vote in favor of banning plastic bags. The length that ordinances have already been in place, along with the demographics of the county, are evidence of how they will vote. For Ralph's, Los Angeles County cannot be overlooked when formulating a campaign strategy, because being the largest market of Kroger by far, an enormous amount of opportunities are created to appeal to the target audiences. Los Angeles County adopted an ordinance in November 2010 that banned the use of plastic bags in unincorporated areas of the county. This ordinance took effect for large retailers in July of 2011 and expanded to other applicable stores by January 2012. Furthermore, there is currently an additional 13 incorporated cities in the county who have adopted a ban. Now, looking at the general county demographics, Los Angeles is the most populous county in the nation with over 10 million residents. Of these residents, just over 6 million are eligible to vote, with about 80% of them being registered. The county leans left with about 50% registered Democrat and only 20% registered Republican, with the rest no party preference. When looking toward the 2016 referendum, voter turnout in Los Angeles County would carry the most influence. LA County had the lowest voter turnout in the state during the 2014 general election, with only 31%. As mentioned earlier, Los Angeles will favor a ban of plastic bags. Voter turnout should only increase, considering this referendum will be on the same ballot as the presidential election. Because of the large amount of eligible voters, increase in turnout can only benefit the support of the plastic bag ban. Now, to focus more on the conservative coast, I will pass it off to Jenny to cover Santa Barbara.
So Santa Barbara County currently has an ordinance in place, and they are very involved in environmental action pursuits. However, since there are only 3 Ralphs in the entire county with no food for lesses, there will be marginable, like a very small margin of impact if you decide to target the Santa Barbara area. So they've had a ban in place since October 2013, and they're charging 10 cents per plastic bag, with smaller stores being required to comply with that by July of the following year. But their demographic data as far as votership is actually the most interesting part because Santa Barbara is made up of 3 main areas, including Lida, Santa Barbara, and the Montecito area. And when they do the census data, I actually was fortunate enough to talk with Brian Broslin, who is in Santa Barbara with their census office. And they generally, when they do polling, it comes out as Democrats with 41.4% of the vote and Republicans with only 30. However, since there is such a large millennial population at UCSB in Lida, their votership is very low for turnout rates, so it actually has created a 10% margin of error that tends to swing more in the Republican favor since there is a large number of people in the 50-plus demographic, and all of them are very dedicated voters. So essentially what you're going to see from that is since only 47% is eligible to vote, and since such a large percentage is millennials who are not very active, though there is going to be a very hard time convincing them to show up to the polls, the large Republican demographic of Santa Barbara is very behind a bag ban since they're so involved in environmental action such as Surfrider and Beacon and the Orphalia Foundation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren, who has a very different political look with the Central Valley.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, so when considering the contested regions in California that might have issue with state-level bag ban, you definitely need to look at the Central Valley. And I certainly can't recommend that the Valley as a whole would be in favor of a statewide ban. But by looking at a few key variables, you should be able to identify for both Ralphs and for political proponents of the ban areas of interest or areas that might be swayed to support it. In terms of the impact on Ralphs, it's going to be very minimal. There are no Ralphs locations in the entire Central Valley, only 12 food for less locations, mostly in the South San Joaquin Valley. So just to give you a very, that 10,000-foot view of the political demographics and what's going on in the Central Valley, I put these two graphs side by side to show you, one, the relative conservative liberal split along the valley and voter turnout in those same areas. And I think it's important, to consider whenever you're creating some sort of political strategy to combine how conservative or how liberal an area might be with the turnout there so that you can make sure you're spending your money as wisely as possible in terms of campaigning. But in terms of identifying areas in the Central Valley that at the county level that might be amenable to a bag ban, I looked at 3 variables: the percent who voted Democrat in the Senate in 2012, the percent favoring state action on global warming, and the percent favoring higher taxes. And while no county in the entire Central Valley has a county level ban, I do think that these 5 counties do present good opportunities for proponents of the ban. You can see that these are the only 5 counties in the entire Central Valley who had values of greater than 50%, who had majorities in each of these 3 preferences that lean towards supporting a ban. And they're placed in order of likelihood to support a statewide ban. So going from Stanislaus to Merced, San Joaquin, and Sacramento, which recently passed its city-level ban at the beginning of April, I would now say is very likely to support a state-level ban and a county-level ban. And YOLO is generally a bit the outlier in terms of being very liberal, but still part of the Central Valley. And there you can see the median values for the Central Valley as a whole, and that generally the percent voting Democrat is very low, well below 50%. The percent favoring higher taxes also below 40%. Interesting though, and why I think there's hope for the Central Valley is that every county had greater than 50% favorability for environmental issues and state action on global warming. But unfortunately, the takeaway for Ralphs is that there are no Ralphs or Kroger locations in these counties. So while these are the best counties to target for a state level ban, it won't be as useful to Ralphs to target the counties that they're in. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will narrow our presentation down to the consumer level focus and how to reach voters.
Thank you, Darren. So as David said at the beginning, we're trying to tell a story and break it down into 3 different parts. We began with part 1, which discussed the historical, environmental, and economic and politics associated with the plastic bag ban, and then we broke it down into county reports to discuss the different demographics and whether or not we think that they would be likely to vote in favor or in opposition of the ban. So now I'm going to take it over to survey and the results that we had concluded from the survey that we had conducted. So we conducted a survey that was performed through the system called Qualtrics, and the reason why we did that is so we could reach consumers and millennials on the same basis. So we figured that the best way in which to reach voters would be to conduct an original survey on college-wide campuses in the Los Angeles region. And we targeted specifically 18 to 25-year-olds, the millennial group that we found were important to address when looking at the ban. We researched message strategies for targeting the general population. And as I said, we also targeted universities in the area to survey millennials, and we found that social media was the best way in order to garner the most results. So though we went in person to contact the individual students on campuses, we got a better response from online survey responses. So as the county data allows us to see an in-depth breakdown of regional perspective on the issue, the survey itself provides a medium to explore the narrative of the research question we sought to tackle itself. Is there a way for Ralphs to promote their environmentally sustainable practices? And if so, how will you guys be able to do that? So results cannot be directly representative of voter opinion in the state itself, just because we cannot conclude that the results from the survey are representative of everyone and all of their opinions, but we did make sure that all of the voters and all the data concluded from the survey were of the age of 18 to 25-year-old. So again, our methodology, we started off with the surveying site called Qualtrics, and we used a trusted site through the University of Southern California in order to gather the data from and around Los Angeles campuses. Again, we targeted a group of 18 to 25-year-olds, and our sample size was about 250. And as for the collection of the data, we distribute it mainly through social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter, and then as well as an in-person contact. So a breakdown of the results. Basically, California's general eligible turnout rate is the lowest 20% in the United States, according to research concluded by UC Davis professor Jonathan Fox. And what we see through the survey accurately depicts that. What we see is that millennials are less likely to actually go out and vote, as we discussed earlier, but are very inclined and very cognizant of environmental issues in and around California. So as they are more likely to support a statewide ban, they're less likely to actually have a tangible effect when going out to the polls and actually having the ability to vote. Though many of them are registered, they may not actually show up to the polls. So most of the participants, as I said, believe that preserving the environment is of great importance, and as we discussed earlier, part of the Gallup poll showed that one of the top 3 issues ranked among most Americans in the state of California especially believed that environmental sustainability was extremely important to them, but whether or not they're actually going to make a tangible effect on passing a ban and passing SB 270 is unlikely. So I have a few survey questions to show that were especially important, and for the purpose of this presentation, I won't be showing you all of them, but if you would like to look at the outline that I gave you towards the very end, I believe it's on page 7. It shows a breakdown of all of the different questions. So for number 1, we asked, how aware are you regarding the plastic bag ban in California? And we have 47% saying that they're very aware of the ban, meaning that they know more than basic knowledge of what SB 27 constitutes, and means that they're very involved on the issue. And then we have 39% saying that they're somewhat aware, and 13% saying that they're not aware at all. So we see here that the issue is not of whether or not we need to increase transparency and visibility of the issue, but how we're going to get them to effectively go out to the polls and vote and make a tangible difference. The second question of importance to us was, did the implementation of the ban affect the amount and or type of bags the respondents had used? And we said We have here 52% said yes, the amount and type changed for them. And then we have 14% saying only the amount changed. We have 14% saying only the type changed. And then 11% saying neither the amount or type changed. And then 9% saying that there was not a ban currently in place in the area that they were living. So number 4 was another issue of importance to us, and it says, when it comes to plastic bags in grocery and retail stores, which of the following would you most prefer? And we have 33% of our respondents saying that they would prefer a complete ban on plastic bags, and 28% a fee on using plastic bags. And then we have 30% saying that they would prefer a choice by the retailer on whether to provide plastic bags, and 8% saying none of the above. So we see that the results are very split up on here, but we also see something where 33% prefer a complete ban on plastic bags, so we see a great amount of preferability in favor of creating a statewide ban again. So the last question that we really wanted to stress importance on was when it comes to elections in November 2016, whether or not they're going to be in favor of banning single-use plastic bags or whether they would like to allow. And 60% said yes, they'd like to ban single-use plastic bags, where we only had 29% saying no, that they would not be in favor of it. So we see here the survey results were definitely our greatest medium in order to garner the view and perspective overall of millennials. And as we said again, the survey results are not representative as a whole of all of 18 to 25-year-olds, but in the area that they are representative only of that subgroup. So in any survey, there are definitely some outliers and limitations, and what we've found that it's extremely hard to test millennials on this issue of banning a plastic bag because of their level of involvement with actually going to grocery stores, having a family to purchase them. As we know, most of the students that we had conducted the surveys for, and most of the students that we're studying from 18 to 25-year-old, the subgroup, are not really going out to Ralph's. They're not going out to the grocery stores to buy a lot of food and a lot of necessities from the grocery store. So that extremely reflects the amount, that significantly reflects the amount of the plastic bags that they would be using. So whether or not their opinion on banning the bag may not really affect the actual outcome for SB 270. So similar to any study, results are swayed by factors such as civic duty and obligatory pressure, another one being in contact surveying. So when we went to the different colleges in the area and reached out to them, the respondents may or may not have had a significant amount of pressure by the friends and, that they were surrounded by, and also by the fact that a lot of them wanted to make sure that they seemed like they knew and were very aware of the issues, because it is a bit of a staggering amount to have around 47% saying that they are very aware of the issue at this age, considering the factors that they are dealing with in the environment that they live in. So now I'm going to be moving it over to Chad David to discuss messaging, an extremely important way in order to garner support of millennials in our generation is to be able to effectively message and to be able to effectively have a strategy to target the voters. And what we've seen, especially as I said in the survey, is that they're not going to be going to the polls and they're not really going to be turning out to vote. So how can we effectively target and garner their support? And that's what Chad will be discussing.
Thank you, Sarah. From researching Rouse and their business practices, we've been able to identify certain messaging variables that are important to look at for the future. In this section, I will cover environmental messaging strategies, including why it is important and some key elements of it. And then I will discuss the aspects of Ralph's green image and its relevance to environmental messaging, and finish by examining potential strategic key aspects and how to respond to them. So what exactly is environmental messaging strategy? Environmental messaging is more complex than simply adding green to a branding platform. To be successful, a strong environmental messaging strategy includes understanding of how the company impacts the people and the environment in which it operates, and applies sustainable business practices throughout every element of its business. According to research into the Sustainable Business Casebook, these 4 key elements are necessary in creating a successful strategy. These key elements are knowledge of the customer, offering quality products that encompasses the message, setting goals for the future of sustainability, and transparency, which involves actively communicating to the customer that their business practices fully embrace their message. In terms of the 2016 election, a strong environmental messaging strategy is important because it encompasses the same values as the supporters. Currently, Kroger's message of environmental sustainability is improving today to protect tomorrow. Mainly over the last decade, Ralph's has done an excellent job in embracing this message. However, competition in the market has also done a great job as well. According to a 2014 report by Willard Bishop, who has published one annually over the past 30 years, fresh format stores have shown strong growth that is taking away customers from traditional markets such as Ralph's. Looking toward 2018, these fresh format stores are expected to continue swift growth of 12.1% annually. Now compare that to the overall share of the market of grocers. Traditional grocery market share is expected to decline from 39.1% in 2013 down to 36% in 2018. In competing against fresh format stores, Ralph's Green Image is the best instrument to use. As of 2013, 27 of 37 Kroger's manufacturing plants achieved the zero waste target. For the past 2 years, Kroger has been awarded part of Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which awards the environmental and social sustainability performance of the top 20% of the 600 largest North American-based companies in the Dow Jones Index. And they've also launched one of the most successful eco-friendly line of products under the Simple Truth brand, which is now valued at over $1 billion and offers over 400 natural and organic products to the customer. And to top it off, it has an anaerobic digester in Compton, California. So then, why is competition an issue? From previously talking with Kendra and research into successful environmental messaging strategies, transparency seems to be the main focus. Ralph's business practices excel in representing the message of sustainability, but conveying this to their customer base needs more focus. On this subject, I would like to zero in on the millennial population again. According to an Ad Age survey, 34% of millennials prefer shopping at traditional supermarkets compared to 44% of the remaining population. So looking at how to address this, we can use the millennials' favorite messaging platform, which is social media. Whole Foods is a fresh format store that serves as a perfect case study of successful messaging to millennials, while spending only 0.4% of total sales on marketing, according to their CEO. Here on the right, you can see a simple table that compares the amount of followers on the 4 biggest social media platforms between Ralph's and Whole Foods. As you can see, there's a slight difference in the amount of followers and like counts, but this does not need to be viewed as bad, however, but instead as potential for growth in terms of messaging strategy and consumer engagement. Now, I would like to shift focus again back to the plastic bag ban and its relevance. In our own survey, we asked, if you own a reusable bag, how often do you remember to bring it when shopping at the supermarket? We found that 35% of people rarely remember their bag, while only 18% often remember it. In order to garner support of the plastic bag ban, people need to be accustomed to the alternate bag options and actually use them. To solve this, we have created the solution of implementing a reusable bag checkout lane at Ralph's stores. To improve the awareness of Ralph's environmental sustainability practices, this new checkout lane would appeal to the eco-friendly shopper by rewarding them with their own lane. Furthermore, this lane would also create the ideal setting for a multitude of environmental advertising and natural product sets. This operational strategy has the potential to guide the consumer to accepting the alternative bag options and rewards the shopper that already has. If there is anything to take away from this section, it is the importance of a strong environmental sustainability message strategy, regardless of the 2016 ballot. Now, I'll pass it off to David for some final recommendations.
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so now that we've completed our story, we have our top 3 recommendations are best bag type, target audience, and informed public. So for the best bag type, so far Ralph's is doing a great job. They're using low density polyethylene bags, and they need to get the word out and inform the public that they are using it, because it is something positive. In addition to that, it's very cost beneficial for Ralph's to have those type of bags. The next thing is to shift the target audience from 18 to 25-year-olds to the latter end, 26 to 34-year-olds, because they typically have families and go to the grocery markets, where the latter generation can just live off of top ramen and kind of go about on popcorn. And then finally, you want to inform the public. You want to inform the public as much as possible the difference between the ban and the referendum. In addition, you also want to be transparent. Let them know what you're doing with the 10 cent, if you can, with the 10 cent fee. And it changes consumer behavior, because then they're more acceptable in saying, okay, that money is going for Ralph's, is going to promote sustainable, conscious sustainable living. That's what we want. We want a better environment. And with that, we really thank you for the opportunity that we had. And on behalf of the group, we learned a lot, and thank you to everyone.
That was great.
Good job, team.
All right. Well, I will turn it over to our experts, perhaps ladies first, if that's all right.
Okay. First and foremost, you guys, phenomenal job. This turned out really, really well. I learned a lot today, and the insight is phenomenal. Really, truly, not only for Ralph's, but for our industry as a whole. And I pledge to each of you to carry your message forward to the industry, and not just stop at my doorstep. So thank you. Great job today. One of the things that I thought was interesting, you mentioned there were several cities that have bans in place, and they mentioned that there has not been a true environmental impact along with those bans. I'm curious if you had the chance, and a lot of the times the reasons we feel that way is because the city next door doesn't have a ban, right? And the wind doesn't stop plastic bags at the border. Did you have an opportunity to maybe look at a place where it is a little more isolated, for example, a county in Hawaii, which has a ban, and they don't necessarily always go that far across, to see if they had any environmental impact, and would that be a story that we can use to help tell this story?
Some of the more isolated ones would definitely be the 4 cities in the Central Valley that actually have bans. But as far as I know, their bans were either too recent, being only 2013 or 2014, that they haven't really conducted litter surveys or litter reports to give you that kind of quantitative information about the effect. And I couldn't say beyond that, because I didn't look into any overflow effects.
There's actually an area on the Gold Coast of Australia that's decided to implement a bag ban. And they've actually seen a significant decrease in the amount of litter that's washing up in the ocean, which they have a similar sort of environmental investment as Californians do, since a large part of their economy, as well as tourism and that sort of thing, revolves around the beaches. And they have seen, after the reports, a significant decrease in the amount of litter in there.
What was the oldest county bag ban that we saw? Was it San Francisco?
Yes.
Yes.
And they didn't have any data on in terms of net impact on that?
Well, for San Francisco, yeah, they did see, specifically San Jose, they did see how it's dramatically decreased litter throughout the community. And it changed the consumer behavior, because as they noticed litter rate decreasing, more people were more inclined to take care of their environment and more willing to be environmentally conscious in the efforts to bring a reusable bag and do away with the plastic bag.
That area isn't as isolated, though, to really give you a good sense about the overflow, because most of the Bay Area has a huge coverage of it, bag ban coverage.
And I'll ask you to speculate now just a little bit, because I know you're all wrapped up in other classes and your real life this week as well. But you may have heard that the state of Arizona recently brought up where they banned other cities from taking action. I'm curious your perspective on how this could affect this vote in 2016, where you have a neighboring state that has said there will be no bans in cities across our state. Any thoughts there?
Well, I think you certainly wouldn't see something like that getting at least anywhere near enough traction to make that the policy in California. Even if we could get kind of close to the referendum, California would never go that far.
Right.
But I would be surprised, just depending on how fast the litigation around that law goes, if that law is still around by 2016. I know there's certainly some groups planning to appeal that.
Yes.
And I think it could really only be an issue if publicity in California is big and like people become aware that Arizona is having a ban.
Banning.
What was very interesting is a lot of the bans, like starting in Washington and Oregon, for example, they're all coastal in DC, and they're starting to move inland. Because they even have it in Chicago, even though they have their own body of water, but they have the bans. And then even down south in Texas, where you have, I believe it's Brownsville, where they implemented a ban, and it's being very successful. It's starting to make its way coastal and work its way inland. So I don't think the ban will be able to uphold if it does pass, or not pass, but I don't think you'll be able to uphold it in Arizona.
I also think that the large number of counties and cities that have already enacted bans, since a referendum is not going to affect them anyway, I think that it's really not going to do anything as far as support of a ban because people are still really invested in the coastal environment. And since there is no coastal environment in Arizona, I think that as a very landlocked state, of course they have different priorities and different interests as far as their environment.
I just want to add to that. I think it's really important to look at the legislative precedent that's already been set in place and the fact that a lot of the counties in California already have a lot of exposure to a ban, so they're definitely willing to see a statewide ban, and they're definitely more inclined to be in favor of a statewide ban as opposed to somewhere like Arizona, which is very landlocked.
I'm curious because I feel like, as you were talking, and great job. I should start with that. You're smart enough to start with that. I'm jumping ahead of my question. But I have this, image of like millennials care a lot about the environment and green issues, and y'all don't vote very much. And I'm wondering if, and that's every generation, doesn't vote when they're young, so it's not just you. But I'm wondering if there's a way that this issue could, and I'm thinking about this in terms of potential partners for folks who are trying to uphold the bag ban, if there are ways that this issue could be used to drive greater millennial participation, which I assume will probably go up because it's a presidential election to begin with, but did you get any sense, or do you have any sense if it's, that's an issue that could compel 18 to even 35-year-olds to vote more than they might otherwise?
Well, I think there is. Certainly, I came in with a bias, feeling that the 10 cent didn't know where to win. If there's transparency, the millennial generation feel like their voice is being heard. And if it's going towards something, if it's going towards environmentally conscious behavior, then they're more inclined to vote for that. But they need to know. They need to know what you're doing. And by having that transparency, they'll feel like their voice is being heard and they can take action. Because if not, they're just standing on the sideline.
I also think a large part of the problem is collective action. So we have a very, very educated number of people in the millennial generation, but I think that because they're educated and they do come to universities like this, they're told about the logistics of voting and, oh, one vote doesn't change a demographic and one vote doesn't make anything happen, and it's really about the Electoral College. So I think that having a very educated generation helps in many ways, but I think it also hurts us as far as thinking that our vote doesn't matter. So I think that if there were more efforts made to tell millennials that they are a significant part of the population and they would be a very significant part of the votership, I think that that would be very effective in garnering more people to come out to the polls who are in that target demographic.
In terms of coming up with a resolution for this, short-term wise, I would not suggest that you guys would gear your focus, I guess, towards the coastal cities, especially Orange County. I think there's a lot of precedent, like I said, and exposure, especially with third-party organizations like Surfrider, and a lot of that social pressure on them to really go out and have environmental awareness and a presence to keep I guess, aware of the issues surrounding them environmentally-wise. But in terms of creating like a robust, strong campaign for the future, I would suggest that we micro-target different community colleges in the area. I know that we did a lot of focus on like the universities in the area, but I think it would be important to target community colleges and maybe come up with a video campaign. And that's something that I was thinking of in the beginning is maybe coming up with like an informative video that discussed the different sustainable practices that Ralph's is involved with. And like we said throughout the presentation, a lot of it has already been done, and you guys have already done such a great job, but bringing the awareness is a big issue. So if we were able to combine all the efforts and all of the things that you guys have already created in an informative video, I think that would be really helpful, and to distribute that via social media.
Or if I can just follow up on
Certainly.
that. First of all, guys, I just want to echo what Steve and Kendra said. It's a tremendous job. When we saw each other last week, you guys did a huge amount of really smart ideas and a huge amount of valuable information. What we've obviously done over the last week is really honed it very effectively into a terrific presentation. So really nicely done. I want to follow up on Steve's question, in particular the point that Jenny addressed about millennials not feeling as if a single vote matters. I saw a study not too long ago on the question of recycling, and they tried a variety of different ways to try to encourage people to recycle, and more effective than providing them data, more effective than trying to shame them into it. The single most effective way of getting people to recycle was to make public a list of the people in their neighborhood and on their block who recycle too. And I'm wondering,
public shaming.
But it wasn't even that shame part. It wasn't saying how all your friends are doing what's wrong with you. Just simply saying, here are the people on your block who are recycling. No judgment entailed at all. And when people see that list and say, oh wow, Sarah's recycling, Chad's recycling, David's recycling, it sort of engendered it. And based on the point that you guys were making earlier, particularly in Chad's presentation, about the benefits of a broader social networking effort for Ralph's as a chain, I'm wondering if you feel, and I'll start with you, Jenny, if you think a millennial generation would be responsive to a example-based campaign. Here's who you know who's doing this.
Yeah, I think that that's actually a very interesting point to bring up. I know that in one of my classes we actually talked a lot about how the Census Bureau and also different candidates for election have kind of played with the idea of setting out lists or tele-automated calls that say, this is who on your street voted last year. So there's also been interesting results in that have showed increased action, not by being told who doesn't vote and like being made to feel bad about it, but being told who else like shares that interest or that investment. And I think that it would be very effective with millennials if something like that was implemented through social media, since our generation has a tendency to idly check it. And so if it was kind of one of those things where a campaign was set up where it was like, oh, I voted at this time or at this place, I think that if you could see that more people in your generation were doing it, it wouldn't any longer be kind of like the outlier thing to do to go and vote. It would be more accepted, and it would be more, oh, the cool thing to do and like the responsible thing to do as an American is to go and vote. And I think that we kind of just have a lack of importance on that because we think that we don't matter when there's so many of us that we actually matter greatly.
I actually have something to say on that too. When I was researching like effective social media structures for increasing environmental awareness for millennials, I found a study that I saw not only in one of my state campaign researching classes, but also for this, and it applies. And it was done by Professor Gerber from Yale University, and he basically showed the effects of social pressure and civic duty and how that really comes into play. And with that, effective social media structures, so one of the things that they did was go out for one of the presidential campaigns, I think it was 2012, where they put a little sticker like in the side, like the ad section, and basically it showed the little faces or pictures, profile pictures of your friends that had voted, and all they had to do was check in and say, hi, I voted, or like, I'm aware about voting today and I plan on voting, are you? So just having that little reminder throughout different social media outlets would be extremely effective, just in terms of the fact that a lot of the millennial generation are very informed on the issue, but whether or not they feel like, again, their impact would actually apply is the issue. So if they were to know that a lot of their friends were doing it, they would, because even in the survey we saw that when we were distributing the survey on college campuses, if their friends were inclined to take it, they would be too. So a lot of it has to do with social pressure effects, and I think that would definitely aid your campaign towards really showing your sustainable efforts and towards actually getting them to vote at the polls.
And then coming off of that, just researching the previous messaging campaigns and successful ones, like in terms of the environment, the most successful ones wasn't a campaign that was from the company pressuring the retailer, it was from social pressures. So continuing social pressures from your peers and other people in the millennial age range, like through social media and various things like that, then it increases the motivation to vote and voter turnout.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm a bit more pessimistic about how
future lawyer here, but
about getting people, at least on this particular issue, to use positive reinforcement to encourage support. Just because it'll likely be attached to the 2016 general ballot. If you can't get people to care about someone like Hillary Clinton or on the other side Ted Cruz being president, then I'm pessimistic that you're going to be able to get them to care about grocery bags, especially when they, as David talked about, have a limited contact with the whole grocery shopping experience. I see it as much more of a passive phenomenon that you see people eventually adopting these practices and just getting used to it over time, to the point that it kind of becomes the default for them. So like the Dornsife LA Times poll that said if you live in an area with a ban, you're much more likely to support it. I see that as kind of being the general trend for the issue.
I'd agree with that as well, but I'd also say that's why it's extremely important to make it relatable to them, and that's why allowing different social media outlets, like increasing presence on Twitter. I know like Whole Foods has a very extensive amount of followers, and Trader Joe's has like its own Twitter website. It's like called Trader Joe's List or something like that. So making it more relatable, making the issues more relatable to them. If we can make it so it's not, oh, whether or not you're going to be passing SB 270, changing like the tone of the message, making sure that the words that are used are more relatable to the voters and really attract their attention would be extremely beneficial. Because yes, there are always going to be issues of whether or not they're going to think, oh, like I'm on Facebook, I really don't want to be thinking about, passing a bill or not, in regards to changing it to, oh, wait, that actually has a great amount of importance to me, and maybe I could be of asset to helping or changing the environment.
Great. Well, wonderful comments all. Thank you all for all your hard work. Certainly.
Super easy, quick question for you guys. Obviously, we're going to be engaged in this discussion next year and this year. But my question to you is, who do you all feel should take the lead on this messaging? Should it be the grocers? Should it be the environmentalists? Who on our side of the issue is the message most effectively received from?
In my opinion, I think third-party organizations like Surfrider can and will have a significant effect, especially because they've already done so much with millennials, especially I know in high school I was involved with the Surfrider organization. They do a great job of branding at a young age, and especially kind of reaching out to the surfers and everyone else who's like inclined to go to the beach a lot. They've done a really great job, but what I think is important is to actually have more of a partnership, so to be able to partner with a third-party organization and to have that affiliation and then send the messages out. That way they know that it's not that Ralph's isn't putting, I guess, aside the issue and they're not having a spokesperson, but Ralph's itself is really going out and encouraging voters and millennials to really make an impact. And that way, I guess, they would feel more important and more involved in the issue if they had more of a leading figure like Ralph's actually speak down with them and talk to them and be able to let them know what's going on and what they've been involved with and how you guys have been moving forward to make your corporation more environmentally sustainable.
I think that the grocers should take the lead, partnered with a third-party organization, only because I looked at Ireland, for example, who has a countrywide ban, and it's been very effective because it changed consumer behavior. So if the consumer knows where that 10 cents is going, because eventually you're going to raise, you're going to change their behavior, and they're going to be more inclined to use reusable bags.
Very good. That's the end of class. Thank you all so much. Yes. Oh, Dan, please.
Oh, yeah, that.
That.
this real quick, and then we will let you guys out of here because I know it's been a long afternoon. But just a couple of things before you go. Most of what I'm going to say is going to be to the students who put on two just tremendous presentations today. Before I do, I want to thank Steve, and I want to thank Kendra, and I want to thank their colleagues at CalStrat and at Ralph's for their involvement and their support of this program, guys. We very, very much appreciate it. I also want to make sure, before we do anything else, that we thank Art, and especially we thank Jody for all the work they've done over the course of this semester to help you guys. Before I go, I want to just tell you, a story. About 4 or 5 years ago, a group of USC trustees came to then President Sample, and they said, we've been thinking about this, and we've been talking about this, Steve. We think if a program were developed that would arm and prepare and educate USC students, USC undergrads, and they're very specific, USC undergrads, to take on some of California's most pressing public policy challenges, we believe that USC students could successfully put together a program, an agenda, a strategy for resolving those problems. And President Sample thought it was a great idea. He gave it to Max McKeas, who was then the provost, who took it to the dean of Dornsife, who brought it to us. Said, okay, figure it out. They said, what do you think? Do you think USC undergraduate students, given the proper training, the proper direction, can come up with plans to take on the state's most serious public policy problems? Education, immigration, healthcare, environmental protection, can that be done? And we said, well, we don't know. We think so, but let's find out. And as we were beginning to figure out how to best put together a program to give SC undergrads that kind of opportunity, I happened to have lunch one day with a colleague of Steve's, a friend of mine by the name of Camden McAfee, who's a graduate of USC from many years ago. And
many years ago.
many years ago, exactly. And Camden was telling me how much he valued his USC experience. In particular, how much he benefited from his opportunity to work as an intern during his time at SC. But he said, you know what struck me is just as valuable as an internship where you go to an office a couple days a week. I wonder if there's a way to put together a program in which USC students could, instead of going to an office to learn about the real world there, basically the real world come to them. And between what the trustees brought to President Sample, and between what my friend Camden and his colleagues like Steve at CalStrat suggested, we put together a program, we put together this program. And for the last 4 years, Kristen? For the last 4 years, every semester, we've gathered a select group of USC undergrads like you guys in giving you a public policy challenge that California State Legislature or the United States Congress or the LA City Council has not been able to resolve. And we can have a longer conversation another day about why that is. But every semester, every year, we reach out to a small number of community partners, like Ralph's, like NALEO, like others, and say, what are you thinking about? What are you concerned about? What are you worrying about? And how can we help? And over the last few years, we've put together the kind of program that you guys have just experienced and been able to prove, and I've been able to do this every semester with huge pride, is go back to those trustees and say, you know what, you were right. USC undergraduate students, age 19, 20, 21 years old, if they're given the proper tools, they can figure out solutions to our most pressing policy challenges. And watching what you guys did today is yet one more affirmation of what a properly motivated Trojan can do if they're pointed in the right direction. So I can't wait to go back to the trustees one more time and say, hey, guess what, it's still working. My guess is that most of you, until a few months ago, did not spend a great deal of time reflecting on what it would take to develop an effective Office of New Americans in the White House, or what it would take to develop a smart and targeted strategy for a plastic bag ban in California. And that's fine, because when you think about the great changes that you're going to make when you finish here at SC, I understand you tend to think not necessarily bigger, but broader than that. And one of the things you've heard a lot, both here and prior to coming to USC, is you hear a lot of people talk about changing the world. I'm going to change the world. I'm going to change the world. How many times have you all heard that? A million times, right, David? Yep. I want to let you in on something. Changing the world is hard. Changing the world is complicated. Changing the world doesn't happen all that much. But what I found, at least, is the way you make a difference, whether it's in a program like this one or in a traditional internship, whether it's a volunteer opportunity, however you do it, the way you really make a difference is not to worry so much about changing the world in all its scope, but rather to pick one particular challenge and take it on the way you guys have. The late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computers, he used to talk about putting a dent in the universe. And I love that quote. I love that quote because what it signifies is the point I was just talking to you about. Changing the world, well, that's a pretty ambitious thing for any one person to take on. But putting a dent in the universe, that's something you can focus on, and that's something you can accomplish. And so if one group of people puts a dent in the universe to help new Americans, if another small group of smart young people puts in a dent in the universe to help preserve California's natural beauty and environment, if every semester, every year, different small groups of smart young people pick out a different spot in the universe, and Art and Jody hand you 5 crowbars, and you well away at them, that's how you change the world. Dent by dent by dent by dent. And the really tremendous thing about what you guys have accomplished this semester is now, compared to January, there's 2 more dents in the universe. And when you keep adding that up, you are going to change the world. So we're really, really, really impressed by what you did. We're really, really proud of you for what you've accomplished over a ridiculously, embarrassingly, unfair short amount of time. And you pulled it off. So we're really, really, like I said, we're really, really impressed and we're really, really proud. But what I want to make sure you know, and I'm positive that Art and Jody has made it clear to you, but I want to reinforce it, is the end of this class does not, whether you are graduating, whether you're not, the end of this class, we hope, doesn't mean the end of our ability to work with you and our willingness to work with you and our hope that we can continue to work with you to figure out how you're going to put that next set of dents in the universe. If you're coming back to SC, come talk to us again, either about another research internship or about a more traditional internship where you do go to City Hall or to Congress or a campaign or an issue advocacy organization. Whether you're getting ready to graduate or not, I know you all probably think occasionally, every once in a while, just for a fleeting moment, about what you might do when you graduate. Just for a moment right there. That's what I thought. So as you think those thoughts, come talk to us. And one of the things that we are all very, very committed to do, not just Art and Jody, but Tanya and Alyssa and Kirsten and Lauren and me, is we want to help you figure out those next steps. Over the years that I've been teaching here, I've made a deal with all of our students, both in the classes that I teach and in the Policy 395. Make a very simple deal with you. Say, we will do anything we can to help you. Anything we can to help you. We will write you letters of recommendation. We will make phone calls on your behalf. We'll do anything we possibly can to help you land that next internship, that next volunteer opportunity, that first job out of school. And all we ask in return is one thing, is that the year after you graduate, I promise you, you're going to get an email from somebody who you don't know with the usc.edu address. And they're going to say to you, hey, Jody Epstein, or Art Auerbach, or Kirsten Olson, or Dan Schnur suggested I get in touch with you, and I thought you might be able to give me some advice. So all we ask in return, when that email comes, is that you be willing to give that young person in the class of 2019, 2020, 2021, how scary does that sound, the class of 2021 at USC? When you get that email, give them a fraction of the time and effort that we've been willing and are still willing to give you. So again, thanks to Steve and to Kendra and to their colleagues. Guys, I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Thanks again to Art and to Jody for all the time and effort they put in all semester long. Most importantly, thanks to all of you for allowing, number one, for allowing me to go back to the trustees and brag yet again about how amazing USC undergrads are. And number two, for putting a couple more dents in the universe. Thanks again. Now you can go.